Crow Canyon ran a base camp trip in Bears Ears last fall, and for the desert, conditions were incredible. All summer, we'd had powerful monsoons, day after day with blue-belly clouds and deluges, and weeks of flash floods. I can't think of one canyon or drainage that I saw where I didn't find fresh flood debris, which meant a second and third bloom of flowers come fall. I don't know how many years it's been since we've seen it like this. By day, we walked cliff bottoms and washes. Scholars came in and talked. Here, Becky Hammond from Ute Mountain Ute looks at a unique rock art panel of a Ute warrior on horseback. The horse faces what appears to be a plumed serpent. It could be a meeting of different traditions. The horse and rider are Ute, and the serpent could be related to Pueblo ancestry, which leaves you wondering what a panel like this would have meant when it was made, how long these traditions have been woven together. Hopi archaeologist Lyle Balenquah was on the trip, and we stopped at a cliff dwelling where he'd been working. He'd been mapping, measuring, assessing, and he was able to see this stone and mortar village through dimensions of time, how it grew, how it collapsed, and how for a while it grew again. The pictographs painted on the back of the alcove relate specifically to Hopi clan history. They are not indecipherable symbols. They mean something.
Artifacts came out of this site. Sandals. I think Tamara also informed me that 10 pairs of sandals.
We explored architecture and time sequences, which rooms were built onto which rooms. You can see where chambers were later joined, a difference in mortar and stacking. Doorways tell stories. You don't go through them. You only look, not touching the stone or the delicate mortar, only reaching out a camera to see inside. Is it ethical? We try to keep our footprint down. Is it needed? I think it's important to make some kind of connection with physical ancestry in a place, to be respectful of it, not touching its fragile parts, standing back most of the time, watching and listening. I got this clip several years ago in Bears Ears. It's a flash flood down White Canyon. I love this kind of event. Water, it appears in the desert, it's roaring down a canyon, the whole place comes alive. Just before the Crow Canyon group came out last fall, a flash flood like this blew out a bridge on Highway 95 crossing Cottonwood Wash. For months the highway was closed and we took a back road getting here, bypassing where the bridge was out, and we set a base camp at the mouth of a canyon. No one else was around because of the bridge. Thanks, flash floods. I was on this Crow Canyon course because of my experience with the land, my attachments to elements, and my background as an author and a field instructor. When it rains out here, like many, I feel it in my blood. It's our first night. We're in Blanding, Utah, and we'll be out in the backcountry tomorrow. But tonight, it's raining. Everything out here revolves around rain. That is the one crucial element of this place. Either rain or the absence of rain. And tonight, it's rain. That summer, I spoke with a Zuni farmer in New Mexico who told me fields were being washed out by floods. People's houses were wrecked. Roads were gone. I asked if he ever wished for rain to stop, and he laughed. Not around here, you never ask for it to stop, he said. He told me it's almost exhausting how much culturally a Zuni person or a Pueblo person thinks about precipitation. He said you go to bed thinking about clouds and rain. You wake up thinking about clouds and rain. The prayers and dances, what are they all about? Clouds and rain. The focus of our trip was ancestry and water. We'd stop to look across the desert for green patches in the boulders, a sign of a spring, a little seep, any form of moisture. I want to turn this over for a moment to the voice of Dr. Susan Ryan, head of field research at Crow Canyon. Most of her work is around Mesa Verde in Colorado, and I asked her to explain how water plays a role in the archaeological record.
As is true for humans across the world, occupation in the central Mesa Verde region was only possible because of an adequate and accessible supply of water. Water was the single most important natural resource for the residents of this landscape. Two forms of water were required: domestic water and precipitation for crops. Domestic water was needed for drinking, pottery production, cooking, and construction activities. Precipitation for crops was needed to meet the requirements of dry land farming plants such as maize, beans, and squash. The occupation of this landscape was made possible by the existence of natural springs. Most springs in the Mesa Verde region are fed by an aquifer system. Precipitation on the ground surface, in the form of rain or snow, infiltrates the soils and the fissures in the sandstone bedrock and percolates downward until it reaches a relatively impermeable shale layer. The water then flows by gravity to an opening where a spring results. It takes approximately a decade for groundwater to be turned into spring water. Hopi community members are known to have significantly increased the volume of water from springs by keeping the area free of vegetation and sediment. In years with lower than normal precipitation, residents could have dug a shallow depression in the bottom of a drainage downslope from a spring to access subsurface water. Today, the Mesa Verde region receives a little more than 11 inches of precipitation annually, yet paleohydraulic studies suggest that precipitation values in the 13th century were higher, receiving about 16 inches of precipitation per year. Crops that are dependent on dry land precipitation requires a minimum of 10 inches of rain or snow annually, but successful crops are more likely to be raised with precipitation values of 20 inches or more. Because rivers and streams were not located near fertile agricultural land to allow for formal irrigation, the skillful management of moisture from direct precipitation was essential for raising crops to maturity in the central Mesa Verde region. Such management included the careful selection of locations for crop fields and the construction of check dams. Crops were often planted in the direct path of runoff, and check dams were constructed where necessary to slow runoff, which allowed maximal infiltration of the moisture into the ground surface. Check dams were important in other ways too, including the slowing of nitrogen-replenishing organic materials and fine-grained sediments to collect over the fields to renew and fertilize them. Data indicate that water management strategies, such as check dams, increased in number and variety in the Mesa Verde region during the late Pueblo II period, or approximately AD 1050 to 1150, a trend that continued until regional depopulation in the late AD 1200s.
This is a cultural landscape. It is a map of human endeavors dating back thousands of years. There are reservoirs, check dams, dwellings, granaries, great houses, and processional roads. Rock faces are storied with petroglyphs and pictographs. Lyle Balenquah took us out to a Hopi ancestral marker in the southern reaches of the monument. I might have walked right by it, thought it was another random stone circle, but there's no such thing as a random stone circle. That's what you learn out here. We won't show a picture of the marker itself, but here's a piece of pottery we found on the ground nearby, proof it was on some kind of pilgrimage, returning to where the people had once lived. In a potsherd, you can see who left it, or at least who they were trading with. You'll see Mesa Verde ware, or something more red, probably brought in from the Canyon region in Arizona. It's why you leave them on the ground where you find them. Let them keep telling their story in that place. What we found at the ancestral marker was small but diagnostic. It's a piece of yellowware, which comes from the Hopi mesas in Arizona, where coal was historically used for firing ceramics. This created a unique yellow oxidization. The sherd came from a vessel from the Hopi mesas more than 100 miles south of here at a different time than when Pueblo people occupied this region. That means Hopi people were returning and left potsherds at this place marking it on an ancestral cultural map.
Here, this is something that is like just yesterday for us, right? So it's still a memory that we retain of our connection to this landscape. We look at things like this, the ceramics, as verification that we've retained that knowledge, that Hopi people have since been making pilgrimages back to an ancestral landscape to honor ancestors before, bringing pottery and other offerings, in tribute to pay their respects. And so there's little features like this all across the landscape that as Hopi people we look for. Those are the, I talked about archaeology sites being the footprints of Hopi ancestors. These are the breadcrumbs that we're literally following back in time, right? We're able to come back out and see the physical proof of not just what happened 1,000 years ago, but perhaps maybe within 100, 200 years of Hopi people coming back up into this landscape and paying homage back to their ancestors, perhaps coming back up to gather resources that are unique to this area. So this is just an important part that we've really started to pick
Migration
up on.
routes have a lot to do with water. Rock art is gathered around springs, and springs form routes of travel, stopovers along pilgrimages or trade routes. I have a question for Balenquah, something we talked about in the field but we don't have on film. How do springs play into Hopi traditions?
It's just another way for us to continue to...
We are of water, and the water is of us. When water is threatened, all living things are threatened. What we do to water, we do to ourselves. There exists a unique connection between Hopi culture and water, including springs. This connection cannot be easily explained in terms of geologic formation and hydrological processes. Hopi people believe water is a divine gift from the ancestors. The phenomena of naturally occurring springs are proof to Hopi people that greater forces exist in the physical world we inhabit. Springs are considered to be living entities that breathe and exhale moisture, a metaphysical connection between the spiritual world of ancestors and the natural world of their descendants. The life-sustaining waters that issue forth are a precious resource, allowing Hopi people and their ancestors to survive within a desert environment. Springs are key components of a Hopi cultural landscape, one that is imbued with the history of a living culture such as Hopi. Many springs are recalled in Hopi oral histories, songs, and prayers. To this day, water is collected from springs, some from great distances, and used within ceremonies back at Hopi. The riparian environment associated with springs and other water sources are also considered culturally important. Specific springs are visited to collect plants, minerals, and pigments for use by Hopi people. In ancestral and historic times, springs drew people together, often being the place where villages were built, such as my home village of Bakavi, or Reed Springs Place, located on 3rd Mesa. When a prolonged drought occurred across the Southwest in the late 12th century, many ancestral Hopi clans migrated to areas where more reliable springs could be found, including the southern Black Mesa area where the Hopi villages are located. Hopi people believe that water under the ground has much to do with rain clouds. Everything depends upon the proper balance being maintained. The water under the ground acts like a magnet, attracting rain from the clouds, and the rain in the clouds acts as a magnet, raising the water table under the ground to the roots of our crops and plants. The granting of life from one world to another is honored with ceremonial offerings left at springs. Hopi anthropologist Farrell Sikiakuku states, "Every time we go out to pray and leave offerings, we also go to a spring, because the spring is very important and represents the bloodline of the earth, who is our mother."
You start thinking about everything in terms of water. To live here means to adapt, to be a creature of water surrounded by drought, punctuated with occasional rains. Some places are wet and some are dry. Everything living here weaves between these two extremes. More you see moving water, because down here it gets into deeper sediments and it tends to sink under the surface. But this is
the first time I've been here in a long time that has not been flown.
That's curious that it's not.
We explored hills made of rubble. These are ruined great houses from a time when more people lived in the Four Corners than live here now, rising and falling and rising on the same range of rainfall we see today. Water is part of culture. When I see rock art, I often think I'm seeing prayers or nods to water. Some of the big anthropomorphs might not be representations of normal human people, but rather personifications of clouds. Carol Patterson, a Crow Canyon archaeological scholar who specializes in rock art, told me that I needed to put myself in the mindset of an animistic culture living here for thousands of years. Drawing a cloud, you wouldn't make it puffy and round. You'd make it into a person. So you can see the multiple tiers on top of that one up there, on top of the head. And those may represent big leather rattles that have been found, booming rattles that either were worn as a headdress or they were carried on a staff and could be shaken and make the sound of thunder. And you see that a lot. You see that up in the canyons north of here, where there are figures with multiple tiers on top of their heads, and over on the San Juan, all these figures with these big rattles that they're, you can just imagine them shaking them and just making this booming sound that's kind of calling the thunder, calling the rain. I talked with a group of Hopi elders in a meeting room almost 2 decades ago, explaining that I was working on archaeology and a personal understanding of an ancient civilization, one to which they belonged. One of them said, "So you're writing fiction?" No matter how much science is involved, yes, to a degree you're making it up. You're imagining the past. I don't have the bloodlines or the traditions myself that might fill in the picture, but I do see outlines in the ground. You'll find that you sit in the same places where they sat, where someone flaked stone to make a tool, and the flakes are still in an arc on the ground 1,000 or more years later. The line between fiction and nonfiction blurs. You walk onto the ground and you begin to see the past.